He had everything. Money, power, the kind of name people whisper, not say. But that night, he was just a man, sitting on a cold floor, in a glass office high above the city, with tears running down his face. And the only person who saw him was a janitor. A poor woman in a blue uniform, a mop leaning beside her, and tired eyes that had seen more pain than she ever spoke about. When she saw him, she didn't scream. She didn't call security. She just sat down beside him. And what she said next would change both their lives forever. You want to know what happened, don't you? How a billionaire ended up crying in front of a janitor. Why a woman who had nothing became the only person who could save the man who had everything. Let me take you back to where it all began. Hi, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to another story for today. If you are ready to enjoy this heartwarming story, smash the subscribe button and comment where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and places. Also, don't forget to check out more of our interesting videos on the channel. And guess what? Tomorrow, I have got an even more exciting story to share with you that I know you'll love. Now back to the story. The hallway was silent. So silent, you could hear the hum of the lights and the squeak of her cleaning cart echoing like ghosts in a cathedral. Bridget Karen was used to the silence. It was her companion, her punishment, her peace. Every night she cleaned floors that weren't hers. Offices that smelled like money and loneliness. She didn't complain, she just worked. One mop stroke after another. But that night something was different. Somewhere down the corridor, through the glass walls of the penthouse office, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in a place this perfect. Soft, shaky, human, crying. Her hands froze. The mop stopped mid-swipe. The sound came again. She followed it. And there, on the floor, his back against the window, his tie undone, his face buried in his hands, was a man she'd only ever seen on magazine covers. Collin Miller, the billionaire who built half the city. The man who turned dirt into gold and people into statistics. But tonight he looked small, broken. She almost left. It wasn't her place. Janitors didn't talk to men like him. But something made her stay. Maybe it was the sound. Maybe it was the look on his face when he realized he wasn't alone. Or maybe it was because she knew that look. The kind that says, I can't do this anymore. She walked closer, set the mop aside, and sat on the floor beside him. Neither spoke. The city lights flickered across the polished tiles, and the air felt heavy, like even the room was holding its breath. Then she said, softly, You don't look rich when you cry like that. You just look tired. He looked up, eyes red, voice shaking, and whispered, Everyone else already left. That's how it started. Not with a handshake, not with power, not with money, but with silence. And a sentence that would break open everything he thought he knew about himself. Because what she didn't know was that his tears weren't for business, or failure, or pride. They were for something far worse. Something that connected them both, long before they ever met. Let me tell you how a single night, between a janitor and a billionaire, became the moment that shook an empire and mended two broken souls. Bridget's hands shook as she sat next to him on the cold office floor. Her mop was still leaning against the wall, forgotten. She had no idea how long they'd been sitting there, the space between them filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Collin Miller, this man who had everything, or so it seemed, looked nothing like the powerful CEO he was known to be. His face, twisted in pain, seemed years older than the man who had built an empire. And yet, there he was, sitting in front of her, crying like a broken man. The kind of man who had no place for tears, at least not in the world he ruled. Bridget was still trying to wrap her mind around it. How had this billionaire, the one who commanded buildings to rise from the ground, ended up on the floor of his office, his body crumpled with grief. She stared at him for a moment longer, watching his chest rise and fall in uneven breaths. It didn't make sense. Then he spoke, his voice raw and broken. "I thought I had it all, you know? Thought if I kept building, kept pushing, I'd be happy." She looked at him, not saying a word. There was nothing she could say that would undo the knot in his chest. But there was something about the way he spoke, the deep sorrow laced with self-doubt, that made Bridget realize this man wasn't the villain she had imagined him to be. He was just a man who had made mistakes, big mistakes, and as he sat there, his tears staining the polished floor beneath him, he started to tell her the story of how he got here, the story that had led him to break in front of her, a woman who had nothing in this world, who had no power, no riches, no name. Collin's voice was barely above a whisper as he began to speak again. His words came slowly, like he was wrestling with them, unsure if he even wanted to let them out. But he did, and Bridget could see the cracks forming in the man who had spent years building walls around his heart. "I wasn't always this ruthless," he said, his eyes distant. "I grew up in a small apartment, one of those places where you could hear the neighbors' arguments through the walls, and the heating didn't work half the time. My mom worked 2 jobs. My dad, well, he was gone before I was old enough to remember him." Collin paused, his lips tightening as he stared down at his hands. Bridget could see the weight of his words sinking in, dragging him back to a time that was long buried. "When I was young, I promised myself I would never go back to that, never be poor. I watched my mom struggle, watched her get stepped on by people who didn't care, and I swore I wouldn't let that happen to me." Bridget couldn't help but think of her own life, the struggles she'd faced, the way her own sister, Jasmine, had fallen through the cracks of the system. The world never saw them. But Collin had done everything to make sure the world saw him. He had climbed so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be on the ground. As he continued, Bridget noticed how his voice lost the edge of defiance, becoming quieter, almost apologetic. "I built an empire. I made it. I got everything I ever wanted. The offices, the towers, the cars, the suits. But the higher I climbed, the less I could feel anything." He looked at her then, his eyes finally meeting hers. "And I hurt a lot of people. I hurt them in ways I didn't even know at the time. But that's how it works, right? In business, it's all about making the tough decisions. You do what you have to do, no matter the cost." Bridget's stomach twisted. She had heard the stories, of course, the stories about people like Collin, the rich men who built their empires on the backs of the poor, the stories about the families evicted from their homes to make way for luxury buildings. It was no secret. She had seen it, felt it, lived it. But now, sitting beside him, she didn't see the monster she expected. She saw a man who was more lost than anything else. And for the first time, she wasn't sure who was the real victim in this story. Collin paused for a long time, as if the weight of everything was crushing him. Bridget waited, her heart pounding, unsure if she should speak or just let him continue. She knew this moment wasn't just about Collin's business failures. This was deeper. It was something that had been eating away at him for years. Then, with a shuddering breath, he finally spoke again, this time with a new kind of sorrow in his voice. "A whistleblower, someone inside the company. They leaked documents. All those deals I thought were just business, just numbers on a page. They're public now. The evictions, the illegal partnerships, the rezoning we did to bulldoze neighborhoods for luxury condos. People are calling me a criminal now." His voice cracked, and Bridget felt her heart skip a beat. The worst part is, it wasn't just business anymore. It was personal, Collin added, his eyes clouding with regret. "I didn't even know what I was doing to the people we displaced. The families who lost everything so I could build my towers. I didn't even know their names. I didn't care. Bridget's stomach churned. Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. She knew the cost of what Collin was talking about. Her sister, Jasmine. She was one of those displaced. Her life had been destroyed for one of Collin's projects. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, trying to absorb what he was telling her. She wasn't sure what she felt. Anger, sorrow, confusion. Maybe all of them at once. But then Collin said something that made her blood run cold. I just found out about one of the people I hurt, Jasmine Karen. She was a tenant in one of those buildings we tore down. I never knew her name, but now I know. She's gone. She took her life after she was evicted. Bridget froze. She couldn't breathe. Her heart seemed to stop in her chest as the words hung in the air. Her sister, Jasmine. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The world seemed to tilt, to shift beneath her feet. Collin looked at her, eyes wide with horror as he realized what he had just said. His voice faltered. I didn't know. I didn't know it was her. Bridget's voice was barely a whisper. You didn't know her name? Collin's face twisted with regret, and the rawness in his eyes shattered something inside her. I didn't know, but I should have. I should have known. She was just a name on a paper to me, and now she's gone because of me. Bridget didn't know what to feel anymore. Her sister's death, the fact that she'd been just another name on a piece of paper to Collin, seemed like a cruel irony. But at the same time, the man beside her wasn't the cold monster she'd imagined. He was someone who had been carrying the weight of that guilt, even if he hadn't known the full cost. The connection between them had deepened in a way that neither of them could have predicted. Bridget didn't forgive him. Not yet. But she understood something she hadn't before. Collin Miller wasn't a monster. He was a man, flawed, broken, and human just like her. The silence that followed Collin's confession stretched between them like a vast chasm. Bridget's breath was shallow, as if the weight of what he had just said had stolen all the air from the room. Jasmine. Her sister's name had hung in the air, too heavy, too real. The woman who had taken her life because of a cold, indifferent system. A system that had been built brick by people like Collin. By him. She stared at him now, but she didn't know what to say. What was left to say? What was left to feel? Collin had broken down in front of her, confessed the damage he had done to families like hers, and yet, she was still struggling to reconcile the man sitting beside her with the face on every magazine cover. He was no longer just the billionaire CEO. He was someone who had looked at her and seen more than just a janitor. He had seen a person, a real person, but that didn't change what had happened. The pain in her chest was as sharp as it was sudden. Jasmine was gone, and it was a world built by people like Collin that had stolen her away. How could she forgive him for that? Bridget stood up slowly, her legs shaky. She turned her back to Collin, trying to gather her thoughts. She didn't want him to see how badly he was affecting her. She wasn't going to let her anger slip. Not yet. But the words burned inside her, demanding to be said. You know, I've spent my whole life trying to make sense of it. Trying to figure out how to survive in a world that doesn't care about people like me. Like Jasmine. It's a world where the rich get richer, and people like my sister, we just get lost. Just a name on a paper somewhere. Bridget's voice was steady, but the pain was there, heavy in every syllable. Collin looked up at her, his face drawn and tired. He didn't speak, but the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. He wasn't just sorry. He was drowning in it. Bridget swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had to say it. She had to make him understand what this had cost her. What it had cost them. You built that world, she said softly, but the words hit like a fist. The one that swallowed my sister whole. The one that turned her into a number. You did that. And now you're sitting here talking about guilt like it's supposed to fix anything. But it doesn't. It doesn't bring her back. Collin's shoulders slumped, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a mountain. He didn't look away. He knew she was right. But what could he say? How could he fix this? There was nothing to fix, really. Nothing that could undo the damage. Nothing that could bring back the woman who had once been so full of life. A woman who had believed in things that Collin had destroyed with the stroke of a pen. Bridget paced the room, her hands trembling at her sides. She wasn't angry at Collin in the way she thought she would be. There was no fire in her chest, no desire to yell at him. Instead, there was a cold, hollow space where her grief used to be. Grief for her sister, for herself, for everything that had been taken. I remember the night she died. It's burned in my memory, Bridget continued, her voice softer now. I got a call from Jasmine. She was crying. I don't know if she thought I wouldn't understand. Maybe she didn't think she had anyone left to turn to. She paused, taking in a shaky breath. She said, "The world doesn't see me. I can't do this anymore." Those were her last words to me. And I couldn't help her. Bridget stopped pacing and looked at Collin. He didn't look away this time. His eyes were glassy, filled with the same raw regret that had filled his voice moments before. "I should have known," she whispered. "I should have done something. I should have been there." Her fists clenched at her sides. "But no, I wasn't there. And I let her down. I let us both down." A long pause followed, thick with unspoken emotions. Collin didn't move, didn't say anything for a long time. Bridget could hear the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. She could feel the tension pulling at her chest. Finally, Collin spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm sorry." The words were barely audible, but they were real. "I didn't know. I never knew." Bridget turned away, blinking back tears that threatened to spill. "And you never asked. You just built your empire, blind to the people it crushed along the way. People like Jasmine." The words stung, but they were true. She didn't want to forgive him. She didn't want to let him off the hook. But there was something inside her. Something that softened as she looked at him. He wasn't the man she thought he was. He wasn't perfect, far from it. But he wasn't the cold, heartless businessman she had assumed. No, Collin was human, just like her. The world he had built was not flawless. It was cracked, broken, and suffocating. And Collin, despite everything, had started to feel those cracks. He had started to see the consequences of his actions, the lives that had been torn apart because of his decisions. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Collin said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't undo what I've done. I can't bring back your sister. But I want to try. I want to change. I have to." Bridget didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she believed him. It wasn't about forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the way Collin had confessed, the way he had exposed himself to her, it was different. It was something that set him apart from the man he had once been. Collin was broken, yes, but so was she. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to fix each other. The silence hung between them for a while, thick and heavy, but not suffocating. There was no going back. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. Bridget looked at him again, her gaze softening ever so slightly. She wasn't ready to forgive. She wasn't ready to let go of the anger, the pain, the betrayal. But she could see something in his eyes now, something that wasn't there before. Remorse, regret, and maybe that was the first step. "I don't know what you expect from me," Bridget said quietly. "But you can't undo what's been done. You can't fix what's broken with just words. He nodded as if understanding. I know. Bridget turned away again. But this time, she didn't feel as alone. Not entirely. You can start by fixing the things you've broken one piece at a time. And maybe you'll start to fix yourself, too. She didn't wait for him to respond. She walked toward the door, but as her hand rested on the handle, she turned back, just for a moment. Collin Miller was no longer the man who had destroyed so many lives, but he was still the man who could help rebuild them. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the man who helped rebuild hers. And that was the first step. The next morning, Bridget was back at work, just like every other day. The sounds of her cleaning cart, the squeak of the wheels on polished marble, the dull thrum of distant conversations, all the usual noise. But there was something different today, something she couldn't shake off. No matter how many times she wiped down another glass surface, mopped another corridor, or pulled at the strings of her tired uniform, she couldn't stop thinking about Collin. And she couldn't stop thinking about the conversation they'd shared the night before. It wasn't just what he had confessed, or the way he had broken down in front of her. It was the way they had connected. Two strangers, worlds apart, sharing a moment of raw truth. It had left something inside her stirred, something that she couldn't quite name. But she would never have imagined that the moment they had shared would turn into something much bigger than either of them ever anticipated. Bridget's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out absent-mindedly, expecting a text from Marley about her schoolwork, but instead, the screen flashed with a notification from Twitter. It read, "Breaking. CEO of Miller Development Collin Miller seen crying in office. Caught on camera with Janitor, who comforts him. Watch the heart-wrenching footage here." Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, staring at the phone screen. The next notification appeared. Janitor in footage identified as Bridget Karen. Viral video captures a rare moment of vulnerability from a billionaire CEO. Bridget's throat went dry. She clicked on the link, hesitating as the familiar, cold blue of her phone lit up her face. And there it was, the footage. The grainy footage from the security camera in Collin's office. Her face, her tired, worn expression, was there, clearer than she could have imagined, sitting beside Collin. The same scene that had felt so personal, so intimate between them now playing in front of the world. The sight of him crying, the vulnerability he showed, and her soft words. "You don't look rich when you cry like that. You just look tired." It was all there, out in the open. She scrolled down, the comments flooding in almost instantly. "This is the kind of humanity we need in business today. Bravo to this janitor for showing real empathy. Wow, Collin Miller is human after all. Who knew? She's got more heart than him. Good on her for showing some real compassion in this cold, corporate world." Bridget's chest tightened as she read them, the overwhelming sense of exposure gnawing at her. She never wanted this. She had never intended to be the center of attention. But there she was, her face plastered across the internet, her words echoing through millions of screens. As she scrolled down further, some comments were harsher, less kind. "Collin's just faking it for sympathy. How convenient for him to cry in front of a janitor who probably needs the job. This feels staged. He's playing the poor billionaire who needs redemption card. I don't buy it. She shouldn't be playing therapist to someone like him. He's still the same monster who built his empire on the backs of the poor." Bridget felt sick to her stomach. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked for her personal pain to be broadcast for the world to see. Yet here it was, her private conversation with Collin Miller, now public property. The whole world was looking at her now, judging her, analyzing every move. But Collin was not left untouched. The media didn't just go after Bridget. They dug into his past, into his companies, into the way his success was built. He became the subject of ridicule, A man exposed, broken down in a way that no one had ever seen before. Headlines screamed, "The billionaire who built towers by breaking lives, and now he's crying." Collin Miller, heartless tycoon or a man finally confronting his past? Is Collin Miller's vulnerability just an act? The question the world is asking. The video had shattered his carefully constructed public image. And the worst part was that he couldn't hide from it. Not anymore. Bridget couldn't help but feel a small pang of sympathy for him. Even though he had hurt her. Even though he had hurt Jasmine. The video had sparked debates. Some praised Collin for showing emotion, for being vulnerable, something that was seen as rare for men in his position. Others called it a pathetic attempt to gain public favor, to distract people from the real issues. To Bridget, it was clear that people would always see him as a villain, even if he had started to change. But Collin wasn't the only one facing the consequences. Bridget was thrust into the spotlight too. She had become the hero in the story, the one who saw the humanity in a man who had spent his life hiding from it. As the phone buzzed again, she saw that a well-known news outlet had offered her $50,000 to tell her side of the story. She didn't even have to think about it. Bridget knew she would never sell herself out for money. It wasn't about that. The next day, the media kept reaching out. Calls, texts, emails. Everyone wanted her story. The offers were tempting, but something in her gut told her that giving in to this kind of attention wouldn't change anything. She had no interest in fame. She didn't need the money. She needed something real. Instead, she wrote. She wrote from the heart, pouring everything into the words she knew people would need to hear. In the quiet of her apartment, after Marley had gone to bed, Bridget wrote an anonymous op-ed. The headline was simple. "The floor is cold. That's where we all bleed the same." It was a reflection of what had happened between her and Collin, a moment of human connection in a world that had long since lost sight of it. She spoke about the things that had hurt her, the things that had shaped her, and the things she had learned from that one single conversation. When she hit send, Bridget didn't know what would happen. Would anyone care? Would they even read it? It didn't matter. She wasn't writing for the world. She was writing for herself. Bridget's words resonated with people, more than she could have ever imagined. The article spread like wildfire. People shared it, talked about it, discussed it in comment sections, and reposted it across every corner of the internet. It wasn't just about Collin. It was about her. It was about them, the invisible people who worked hard and fought every day to survive in a world that didn't notice them. It was a reminder that everyone has a story, and those stories mattered. The media caught on. Talk shows began discussing the op-ed. People from all walks of life reached out to her, thanking her for giving them a voice, for making them feel seen. Bridget wasn't sure where this would all lead, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Collin anymore. This was about a movement, about showing humanity in a world that had long stopped caring. And for the first time in a long while, Bridget felt like she was on the right path. The days that followed were a blur. Bridget tried to ignore the noise, the endless messages, the media requests, the sudden shift in the world around her. But it was impossible. People had seen her now. They knew her story. The video of Collin, a billionaire brought low by vulnerability, and her comforting him in his moment of weakness. It was everywhere. The world had seen them both, and the weight of that exposure was like a heavy chain, dragging her through each day. Bridget had always prided herself on being invisible, unnoticed. It had been a defense mechanism, a shield that allowed her to exist without drawing attention. But now nothing was private anymore. Her thoughts, her pain, her past, they were all for display, and there was something unnerving about it, something unsettling. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't asked for the world to see her, to know her, to make her their latest fascination. But the world wasn't the only thing that had changed. At home, things were unraveling too. Bridget had always known that Marley would face struggles because of her job. It came with the territory, the sneers, the whispered comments, the feeling of being on the outside, looking in. But she never expected this. Marley, her bright, determined daughter, her everything, had been expelled from her private school. The letter was waiting for her when she returned home from work one evening, shoved under the door with an air of finality. Bridget's hands trembled as she opened it. The words blurred before her eyes. Behavioral issues, negative influence, inappropriate association. It didn't take much to connect the dots. Marley had been bullied for weeks, for being the janitor's kid, for having a mother who wasn't a somebody, for the video, for Bridget's newfound fame. The cruel words from the other children, the looks from the parents, and the whispers in the hallways had built to a breaking point. And now it was official. Bridget's heart shattered in her chest. She had always worked so hard to shield Marley from the harshness of the world. She wanted to give her a better life, one where she didn't have to worry about being judged for things that were out of her control. But now, she couldn't protect her anymore. Her mind raced. The weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders. She felt like she was failing. Marley deserved better than this. She deserved more than what this school or any school had to offer. The following morning, Bridget was numb. She didn't know how to tell Marley. She didn't know how to explain that the world had decided, again, that they weren't good enough. But before she could gather her thoughts, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Collin. "We need to talk. I'm coming over." Bridget's first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend that nothing had changed. But something inside her stopped her. She didn't want him involved. She didn't want him fixing things for her, not after everything that had happened. But Collin had a way of worming into her life, a way of showing up when she least expected it. She didn't respond. But a few hours later, there he was, standing at her door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His expression was solemn, and for once, it wasn't the confident, polished look he always wore. No, this was different. "Bridget," he said quietly, his voice laced with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "We need to talk about Marley." Bridget didn't even invite him in. "I don't need your help with this," she snapped, her voice tight. "I'll handle it." Collin's eyes darkened with concern, but he didn't push. "I've already spoken with the school board," he said. His voice was calm, steady, as if he had already made up his mind. "Marley's been expelled, and I know why. I want to help." Bridget felt her chest tighten. She didn't want his help. She didn't want him to fix this. She didn't want him to feel like he had the right to swoop in and rescue them. Not when his past decisions had led to this very moment. But there was something in his eyes, something that softened her resolve. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" "I've been a part of the problem for far too long," Collin said, his voice thick with regret. "But I'm done running from it. If I can help fix some of the damage I've caused, I will. And this," he gestured toward the house. "This is one of those times." Bridget looked away, trying to hold her ground. But deep down, she knew she couldn't handle this on her own. She had tried, and she was failing. Collin's offer was like a lifeline. But would she accept it? "I'll speak to the school board," Collin continued. "I'll make sure Marley's reinstated. You won't have to fight this alone." Bridget's chest tightened. She wanted to refuse him, to push him away, but there was something in his tone, a quiet, steady determination, that made her pause. "I'm not asking you to fix everything," she said, the words coming out more broken than she intended. "I'm asking for one thing. Don't make this about you. Collin nodded slowly. I won't. I promise. The next day, Bridget found herself sitting at the back of the school board meeting, a knot of tension tightening in her stomach. Marley was sitting beside her, her face pale, trying not to look at the group of snobbish faces in the front of the room. Bridget's nerves were on edge, but she wasn't the one who needed to speak today. It was Collin, and when he walked into the room, it was like a shift in the air. All eyes turned toward him, surprised to see the man whose name had been splashed across every headline in the country. The whispers began almost immediately, but Collin didn't flinch. He walked straight to the front, standing tall in front of the board members, his posture confident. Bridget was surprised. She expected him to falter, to shrink back in the face of their judgment. But no, he didn't. I'm Collin Miller, he said, his voice booming in the quiet room. And I'm here because of one thing, integrity. He looked right at the board members, his gaze steady. This school's attitude toward my daughter is disgusting. You've expelled her simply because of her mother's job, because of your perception of her worth. And that ends today. Bridget's eyes widened. This wasn't the Collin Miller she had known. This was someone different, someone who cared. You all like to call yourselves elite, Collin continued, his tone biting. But what kind of elite treats children this way? You should be ashamed of yourselves. The value of a person isn't in their wealth or their class. It's in their character. And I see a lot of character in Marley. A lot more than I see in most of you. The room went silent. Bridget felt her heart race. But this time, it wasn't from anger. It was from something else, something warmer. Collin wasn't just fighting for Marley. He was fighting for what was right, for integrity, for the things that mattered. The board members looked at each other, unsure how to respond. But Collin wasn't done. I will not let you disgrace my family or my daughter anymore, he said firmly. Marley is reinstated, and if you want to keep your jobs here, you'll learn to treat all students with respect. As the meeting ended and Marley was officially reinstated, Bridget didn't know how to feel. Collin had stepped in. He had defended her daughter. He had done more than she expected him to do. But even in the midst of this unexpected victory, there was a tension between them. She wasn't ready to forgive him. She wasn't ready to trust him completely. His past, the things he had done, were still too fresh in her mind. But as they walked out of the meeting room together, something shifted between them. Bridget didn't know what it was yet, but she could feel it. There was a strange, fragile connection starting to grow between them. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something different. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation as Bridget sat in the back row, her hands clasped tightly together. The press conference was about to start, and there was a chill that ran down her spine. This moment, this decision Collin was making, it wasn't just about his future. It was about everything that had led up to this. About the man he had been, the mistakes he had made, and the man he was trying to become. Bridget hadn't expected him to go this far. She hadn't expected him to take this step, but then again, Collin Miller had always been someone who did things on his own terms. Whether it was building his empire or destroying it, he never did anything halfway. Today, he was about to make the biggest decision of his life. He was stepping down as the CEO of Miller Development Group. Bridget didn't know what to feel. She had seen the fallout from his actions, the lives shattered in his wake, including her sister's. He had been a part of that destruction, and for that, he could never be free of the weight. But in front of her, there was this man who was trying to take responsibility, who was trying to make things right in a way she hadn't expected. He had already exposed so much. The leaked documents had torn apart his carefully constructed world. Now it was time for him to speak the truth, to name names, to bring to light everything that had been hidden for years. The press conference started like any other. The polished, intimidating atmosphere of a corporate event, all the flashing cameras, the hushed murmurs in the crowd. But this time it felt different. The tension in the room wasn't from speculation about numbers or quarterly earnings. It wasn't about the latest deal or new building project. This was about truth. Collin stepped up to the podium, his face set in determination. His usual confidence was gone. Today, he wasn't the billionaire CEO who commanded rooms. Today, he was the man who had to make things right. And Bridget couldn't help but admire the courage it took to stand up there. He took a deep breath, eyes scanning the room before he began. His voice steady but raw. I've spent my life building things. Luxury towers, million-dollar deals, empires. I've lived in a world where success was the only thing that mattered, where people were tools to be used. I was blind to the damage I caused. His words hung heavy in the air, the silence in the room stretching, thick with the weight of his confession. I'm here today to take responsibility for that damage, to expose the truth behind Miller Development Group and the unethical, illegal practices we've used to build our wealth. There was a collective gasp as the press room went still. Bridget's breath hitched. She had heard the whispers, the rumors, the reports of shady deals, but hearing Collin speak it aloud, it was a different kind of truth, a truth that couldn't be denied. I'm not proud of what we've done. The evictions, the displacement of families, the destruction of communities, these were not just business decisions. These were decisions that affected real lives, real families, people who were hurt, people who were forgotten, people like Bridget's sister, Jasmine. Bridget felt her heart stop as his words sank in. Jasmine's name, her sister's name, spoken so plainly in front of the world. Collin wasn't just acknowledging the damage. He was taking ownership of it. He wasn't trying to protect himself anymore. He wasn't hiding behind his title, behind his wealth. He continued, the weight of his words settling into the room like a heavy stone. I'm naming those responsible for these practices. My colleagues, the members of the board who turned a blind eye, and those who encouraged the unethical and illegal actions that allowed this to happen. Collin named names, big names, powerful people. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He wasn't running from the truth anymore. And for the first time, Bridget saw something else in him, something she hadn't seen before. He was no longer the man who avoided responsibility. He was the man who was finally facing it, and for all the damage he had caused, it was a step toward redemption. The reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word, every detail. The room buzzed with disbelief. The man who had built an empire on the backs of others was now destroying it, piece by piece, with his own hands. Bridget sat back, watching him closely. As the reporters shouted questions, demanding answers, she couldn't help but think about the man he used to be. The man who had walked into her office that night, so broken, so lost. That man was gone now. In his place was someone who was standing up, who was taking ownership of the mistakes, who was trying to fix what had been broken. She didn't know if she could forgive him. Not yet. Could anyone truly forgive the kind of destruction he had caused? But in this moment, she realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past. It wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about understanding that people could change. It was about accepting that some things could never be fixed, but the effort to make them right could make all the difference. Bridget looked at Collin, his face pale but determined as he answered questions. She saw a man who had finally opened his eyes, a man who was fighting for something better, even though it was too late for many. She was angry. She was still angry about Jasmine, about the way her sister had been discarded by the system Collin had built. But as the press conference came to a close, and as Collin stepped away from the podium, Bridget felt something shift inside her. A small seed of understanding, of empathy, began to take root. After the conference ended, Collin approached her, his face tired but resolved. "Bridget," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the crowd of reporters. "I did it. I exposed everything. I don't know what's next, but I had to do this. For Jasmine. For all the people I hurt." Bridget's chest tightened as she looked at him. The man who had caused her so much pain, the man who had been responsible for the loss of her sister. He was here trying to make things right. She didn't know how to feel. The hurt was still there. The betrayal. The anger. But maybe there was something else too. Maybe there was hope. "You don't get to undo it," she said, her voice low but steady. "But I see what you're doing. I see that you're trying. That's something." Collin nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I never will. But I hope I can show you I'm trying." Bridget watched him for a long moment, the weight of his sincerity pressing against the walls of her heart. She didn't know if she could ever fully forgive him, but maybe forgiveness wasn't something she had to give right away. Maybe, like Collin, it was something she needed to work toward. The room cleared out, and Collin walked with her to the door. Bridget wasn't sure what came next. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure of anything. But one thing was certain. Collin Miller wasn't the man who had broken her world. He was a man who was trying to rebuild it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The morning sun filtered softly through the thin curtains in Bridget's apartment, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. It was quiet, the kind of stillness that always seemed to wrap itself around her early mornings. She sat at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee in front of her, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup as her thoughts wandered. Everything had changed. The events of the past few months. Collin's fall from grace, his efforts to make amends, the viral video, the media storm, had sent ripples through their lives, reshaping everything. Bridget had always been someone who worked in the shadows, invisible to the world, but now she was no longer hidden. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a simple text from Collin. "Coffee at 10? I found something I think you'll like." Bridget couldn't help but smile. Things were different now, yes, but there was something undeniably comforting in these small moments. The awkward silences, the shared glances, the quiet, unspoken understanding. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the phone screen, contemplating. Their relationship had never been traditional. It wasn't a love story in the sense most people imagined. But there was something between them, something raw, honest, and unexpectedly strong. She didn't know where it was headed, but she was starting to think that was okay. The ripple effect. Collin had stepped away from his empire. He had walked away from the world of boardrooms, luxury apartments, and billion-dollar deals. His resignation was public, and the media had taken their shots. They had called him weak, naive, even a coward. But Bridget had seen something different in him. Collin Miller, the man who had once ruled an empire with cold, calculated precision, was now working part-time as a maintenance worker at Jasmine Place, the affordable housing co-op that Bridget had helped establish with the new nonprofit she had formed. The building, named after Bridget's sister, was a place for families who had lost their homes to the kind of development Collin had once championed. It wasn't just a roof over their heads. It was a symbol, a new beginning. And Collin was there, every day, working side by side with the residents. The man who once had dozens of people working under him was now fixing leaky faucets, replacing broken light bulbs, and sweeping floors. It was humbling, and Bridget knew it wasn't easy. But she also saw the change in him. It wasn't just his actions, it was his heart. The man who had spent years building skyscrapers was now helping to rebuild lives. Bridget had never imagined that this would be her life. She had never dreamed that she would be part of something bigger than herself, something that could help make the world just a little bit better. But here she was, building a community, helping families find stability, and rebuilding a piece of her own heart that she thought had been broken forever. Collin had his own reasons for being there. He didn't talk about them much, but Bridget didn't need to ask. He was making it right, one small action at a time. He wasn't trying to erase his past, but he was doing what he could to make a difference now. As Bridget stood at the front of the community center that evening, addressing a small crowd of tenants, she could feel the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This was her mission now, the project she had poured everything into, the dream of affordable housing for those who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't just about providing homes, it was about giving people back their dignity. The work at Jasmine Place was harder than she had ever imagined. There were setbacks, delays, and, at times, overwhelming frustration. But there were also moments of victory, small victories, but they were victories all the same. Seeing a family move into a new apartment, seeing the joy in their eyes, the relief on their faces, that was everything. And even though she had stepped into a leadership role she never thought she would have, Bridget never lost sight of the bigger picture. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about punishing the people who had hurt her sister. This was about creating something better, something that would stand as a testament to what could be built when people work together, despite their pasts. As she spoke to the residents, a sense of pride washed over her. She had never felt more sure of herself, more certain that this was where she was meant to be. She was helping people in a way she never thought possible. And Collin, standing off to the side, watching her with quiet admiration, had become an integral part of it all. He wasn't just a helper. He wasn't there as a businessman trying to fix his reputation. He was there because he believed in the mission. He was there because he was trying to make a difference. After the meeting, Bridget found Collin outside, leaning against a brick wall, his sleeves rolled up, looking more like a worker than the man who had once worn suits worth thousands. There was something about the simplicity of his presence that made Bridget feel grounded. He had become part of her world in a way she hadn't expected. "Anything I missed in there?" Collin asked, his voice warm with a hint of humor. Bridget smiled, leaning against the wall beside him. "Just the usual. Complaints, suggestions, the occasional thank you." Collin nodded, his eyes lingering on the building. He had spent hours fixing broken pipes and repainting walls, but he didn't mind. It was real work, the kind of work that made a difference. "You know," Collin said after a pause, "I never thought I'd be doing this. I used to think I had it all figured out. But it turns out I had it all wrong." Bridget nodded, her gaze following his. "You're not the same person you were." He turned to her, a slight frown crossing his face. "I know. I just wish I could have realized sooner what mattered." She didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't have to. The silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding. They had both changed, not just because of what had happened, but because they had chosen to change. "Do you ever wonder?" Bridget started, hesitating, unsure if she should voice the thought, but she did anyway. "Do you ever wonder if we're really making a difference?" Collin's eyes softened. "Every day," he said quietly. "But you're making something real here, Bridget. You're doing more than anyone else could. This is the kind of change that lasts." Bridget looked at him, a flicker of something deep inside her stirring. She wasn't sure what it was yet, whether it was forgiveness or just the recognition of how far they had both come. But for the first time, she felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. "We're both rebuilding," she said after a moment. Collin met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady, We are. As the weeks passed, the small, fragile connection between Bridget and Collin continued to grow. They weren't rushing anything. They weren't trying to fix everything overnight. But they were working together side by side, not just to rebuild the buildings at Jasmine Place, but to rebuild the parts of themselves that had been broken along the way. They met regularly, sometimes for coffee, sometimes to walk through the building together, making plans for what came next. There was an ease to it now, a quiet understanding that didn't require words. They were both on this path not just for their own healing, but for the healing of others. As Bridget walked through the hallways of Jasmine Place one evening, watching the families settle in and make the apartments their own, she realized something important. This was the beginning, not just for the families who lived here, but for her, for Collin, for everything they were creating together. And maybe, just maybe, the world was ready for something different, something real. The morning of the ribbon-cutting ceremony at Jasmine Place was unlike any Bridget had ever experienced. The sky was clear, the sun a soft, golden glow that seemed to reflect the promise of a new beginning. It wasn't a grand affair. No crowds of high-powered businessmen or politicians. No flashing cameras or extravagant speeches. It was just the community and the people who had made it possible. Those who had fought, worked, and hoped together. It was, in every way, small and humble, yet it felt like the most important thing Bridget had ever done. She stood at the entrance of the building, her eyes scanning the crowd of residents who had gathered. There were a few familiar faces, families that had moved in recently, some who had already begun to settle in and decorate their new homes. There were children running around, their laughter echoing in the halls, a sound that seemed so precious in a world that so often ignored them. Bridget smiled to herself, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. This was it. This was what all the hard work had led to. This was what mattered. It wasn't about the money or the fame or the recognition. It was about people, about creating a place where they could feel safe, valued, and respected. A place to belong. And Collin, standing beside her, looked nothing like the man who had walked into her life months ago. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now radiated something softer, something more human. His hands, once used for signing contracts and shaking the hands of CEOs, now held a paintbrush or a wrench, doing the work that needed to be done without question. The change in him was subtle but profound. He wasn't just fixing the building anymore. He was fixing something inside himself too. And Bridget saw it every day, in the way he treated people with kindness, in the way he worked side by side with the residents of Jasmine Place without ever trying to place himself above them. Collin wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't the powerful man who once thought that money was everything. He was just a man trying to do the right thing, trying to be better. And Bridget, well, she wasn't the same woman either. The anger, the resentment, the pain, they were still there, of course, but now they didn't rule her. She had forgiven herself, and in doing so, she had forgiven the people who had hurt her, including Collin. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't something she could explain in a single breath. But over time, she had come to understand that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about freeing yourself from it. It was about giving yourself the power to move forward. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was brief, the kind of event that felt more personal than anything. Bridget stepped forward first, standing in front of the small group of residents and community members who had gathered to witness this moment. The words came easily now, though they hadn't always. She cleared her throat and smiled, her voice steady as she spoke. Jasmine Place is more than just a building. It's a home, a place where families can feel safe. It's a place where the people who live here can have a future, not just a roof over their heads. This project started as a dream, a vision of what could be. And today we see that dream come to life. She glanced over at Collin, who was standing beside her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze focused on the crowd. He was part of this too, part of something bigger than either of them. He had helped make this possible. And she knew, deep down, that his presence here wasn't just about fixing what he'd broken. It was about building something new. We've come a long way, and there's still so much work to do, Bridget continued, her smile growing. But what we have here today is proof that change is possible. That when we come together, when we do the work with heart and integrity, we can make a difference. This is just the beginning. With that, she motioned to Collin, who stepped forward and, with a small nod, helped her cut the ribbon. The crowd clapped, a ripple of joy and celebration sweeping through the air. But it wasn't the applause that filled Bridget's heart. It was the quiet, unspoken bond that had formed between her and Collin. The work they had done together, the trust they had built, and the healing that had taken place, not just in the community but in themselves. After the ceremony, the residents of Jasmine Place began to gather in the common area, mingling and talking excitedly about their new homes. Bridget and Collin stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. For a moment there was silence between them, but it was a comfortable silence. Not awkward, but full of meaning. Collin turned to her, his gaze steady and calm. "You did it," he said softly. This is what you've worked for." Bridget smiled, her eyes a little misty. "We did it," she corrected him. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. We all built this." Collin nodded. "But you led it. You gave it life." For a moment, Bridget didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being praised, to being seen as a leader. She had always been the one working behind the scenes, the one who stayed invisible. But now she felt like she had found her place. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "You helped make this happen. You changed." Collin's expression softened, and he took a small step closer to her. I had to change. I couldn't keep pretending to be the person I was. And I'm sorry for everything. For your sister. For the way I've hurt people." Bridget's heart ached, but in a way that felt lighter than before. She had already forgiven him in her own way. She didn't need more apologies. She needed action, and he had given her that. "You're not the man you used to be," she said, her voice steady. "And that's enough for me." They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the families moving in, laughing, finding their places in the world. There was no grand gesture, no magical moment, just two people quietly recognizing the journey they had both been on. They had come full circle. And in this moment, Bridget realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting that the past had shaped them and that they were both capable of change. They didn't need to undo the mistakes. They just needed to move forward. And that was what they were doing. As the evening wore on, the last of the families settled in. The lights of Jasmine Place glowed warmly against the growing darkness, a beacon of hope and new beginnings. Bridget felt something deep inside her shift. She had come so far, and the road ahead was still long. But now, she felt ready. Ready for whatever came next. She glanced at Collin, who was talking to a group of residents, laughing with them as if he had always been a part of this community. And maybe, in a way, he had always been part of it. Just not in the way he had expected. When Collin finished talking to the group and walked over to Bridget, he gave her a small smile. "What now?" he asked. Bridget paused, looking at the glowing lights of Jasmine Place, at the families who had begun to settle in, at the future they were all building together. "We rebuild," she said, her voice full of quiet certainty. "One step at a time." And for the first time in a long while, Bridget knew that everything would be all right. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden light across the city. The streets, usually bustling with noise and chaos, were still, quiet in a way that made everything feel more intimate. Bridget stood on the balcony of her small apartment, looking out over the horizon. The air was crisp, and as she inhaled deeply, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. This was her moment. A year ago, she would have never imagined that she'd be standing here, in this place with this life. A year ago, she was just a janitor at a luxury building, invisible to the world, hidden behind the walls of other people's success. But today she was something more. She was part of something that mattered. Her eyes drifted across the landscape, to the distant buildings that had once felt like symbols of all she didn't have. The glistening towers of the city, places where people with power and wealth resided. And yet now Bridget felt a strange sense of pride when she looked at the view. She had a place in this world now, a place she had helped create. The building below her was a testament to that. A small, humble victory in a world that often overlooked people like her. Jasmine Place, the community she had helped establish, was thriving. It was no longer just an idea or a dream. It was a living, breathing part of the city, where families who had once been displaced, thrown away by the system, now had a place to call home. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a text from Collin. Coffee at the usual place? Bridget smiled to herself. They'd both come so far since that first meeting. The night Collin had sat on the cold floor of his office, broken, with nowhere to go but down. The man who had once seen people like her as mere tools was now the man who was helping rebuild what he had torn down. They had become something more than just a janitor and a billionaire. Bridget had always thought that her life would be defined by what she lacked, by the absence of wealth, the absence of security. But now she saw that the true measure of life wasn't in the things you accumulated. It was in the things you built. And she had built something real. The cafe was quiet when she walked in, the morning rush just beginning to pick up. Collin was already there, sitting at their usual table by the window, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening into a smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm, like it always was when he saw her. He had changed so much over the last year. Gone was the arrogant CEO who looked down on everyone, replaced by a man who had learned the hard way what really mattered. He stood and pulled out the chair for her, a small gesture that meant more than words could say. Bridget sat down, taking a sip of her coffee. There was something comfortable about their routine now. No need for pretense. No need to pretend that they had all the answers. They didn't, but they had each other, and that was enough. "How's everything at Jasmine Place?" Collin asked, his eyes searching hers, eager to know how things were going. "Good. Really good," Bridget replied, her eyes lighting up at the thought of it. "We've had a few more families move in, and they're already making it their own. It's more than just a place to live, Collin. It's a community. It's what we both dreamed of." Collin nodded, a look of pride crossing his face. "You did it, Bridget. You made this happen." Bridget shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "We did it. This wasn't just me." Collin reached across the table, his hand brushing hers in a way that felt natural now, comfortable. There was no tension anymore, no walls between them. What had started as a fragile connection, two people from different worlds, had transformed into something solid. They had both changed, and with that change had come a bond that was built on something real. Bridget had always believed that it was the small things that mattered the most. It wasn't the grand gestures or the speeches. It was the moments of honesty, the quiet acts of kindness, the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. And in this new community, those small acts were happening every day. People were helping each other, sharing meals, supporting one another. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But there was something genuine here, something Bridget had worked so hard to create. The building was more than just bricks and mortar. It was hope. It was a place where people could feel safe, where they could dream again. Families who had been torn apart by the greed of the system now had a chance to rebuild their lives. And as Bridget stood at the front of the building, watching the children play, the laughter echoing through the halls, she realized something important. They had done something lasting. For the first time in a long time, Bridget felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. "You know, I never thought I'd end up here," Collin said one afternoon as they walked through the building, inspecting the repairs. "I thought success was all about money, all about power. But now, I see what really matters." Bridget smiled, glancing over at him. "It took a while, but I think you figured it out." He grinned back, his eyes sparkling with something Bridget hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine happiness. "I think I'm finally starting to understand what it means to build something that lasts," Collin said. "Something that isn't about taking from others but giving. Something that changes lives." Bridget nodded. "It's about more than just the buildings. It's about the people. And I think you get that now." They stopped at the entrance, watching a few residents move in their belongings, smiling and laughing. Collin's hand brushed against hers, and this time, Bridget didn't pull away. They stood there together, in this space they had built, their hearts quietly in sync. "You know," Bridget said, looking out at the scene before her, "I never thought I'd be doing something like this, but now, I can't imagine doing anything else." "I feel the same way," Collin replied, his voice steady. "I'm not who I was. I'm not the man I used to be, and that's the best part of it all." Bridget smiled softly, feeling something shift deep inside her. This was the beginning, not just for the people of Jasmine Place, but for both of them. They weren't perfect, and they never would be. They didn't have all the answers, but they had each other, and they had built something real. As they walked away from the building, the sound of children's laughter drifting in the background, Bridget's heart felt lighter than it had in years. This was her life now. Not a life of quiet desperation or fear of being invisible, but a life of purpose, a life of meaning, a life where she wasn't just a janitor anymore. She was an architect of change, and the world was ready for it.
Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.